DYS4IA is an autobiographical Adobe Flash video game made by transgender designer Anthropy on her experience of taking hormone control therapy. The game is divided into 4 chapters, namely gender bullshit, medical bullshit, hormonal bullshit, and it gets better, together of which tell the story of Anthropy's bittersweet journey to find her own identity through external interaction with the surrounding and internal reconciliation with herself. While playing this game, I found that it creates an interesting conversation with a reading from our first week's class. In David Meyer's essay, The Video Game Aesthetic Play as Form, he introduces the concept of anti-form as people's default understanding to games. He wrote, "All forms of play transmit a self-referential message. This is play," or alternatively, "This is not real." When we play with self, the self is something other than what it is, an anti-self. The contents of play, those objects and forms that are played with, are, again, less characteristic of the play experience than the formal properties of the boundary condition itself. This boundary condition results from negation, or notness, or from what I will call here, an anti-form. So, according to Meyer, the essential part of play experience is the anti-form, the acknowledgement that it is not real. And knowing that there is this clear distinction between the games and the reality allows people to challenge, avoid, and deny what they see and experience in the game. However, DYS4IA uses its careful design to challenge the concept of game as an anti-form and constantly brings in real-world experience to bridge the gap between the virtual and the real. Even if players play the avatar in this virtual setting with an initial thought of this game being an anti-form, the game experience successfully allows players to generate an authentic feeling Anthropy had as a transgender person taking hormone control therapy. In other words, through game mechanics, use of metaphor, and unique aesthetic decision, this game successfully breaks the boundary between the game world and the real world, generates feelings that get carried on to real life even after the game ends, and extends the scope of what game experience can offer. DYS4IA is no longer an escape from the reality. Rather, it becomes the reality itself. One unique feature that helps DYS4IA achieve its goal is players' lack of agency while playing the game. Unlike typical video games that allow them to control over the avatars and move freely, the game mechanics of DYS4IA leaves almost no space for players to explore or act based on their own free will. Instead, the game clearly sets up everything and tells players exactly what to do using arrows and sentences, and players are only expected to follow the instruction and proceed. For example, in the scene where the avatar passes a group of people, knowing that the game expected me to move from left to right, I tried to let the avatar go in the opposite direction. The avatar ended up just getting stuck and was not able to move at all, forcing me to follow the game's expectation. In fact, the game exerts ruthless dominance over players to an extremity by proceeding to the next chapter no matter what action players take. Player can make no decision, and they will not be rewarded or punished for their performance, as the game will either push the players to the next stage or get stuck until they correct themselves and do the exact same thing as expected. Players are not the center of the game, and their individual experience are not aimed to be satisfied at all. The lack of players' agency is in fact an intentional design by the game designer to generate empathy within the players, and a means to an end of forcing them to relate to the author of this autobiography, namely the game designer Anthropy. As we can see from the first chapter, Anthropy's decision to take hormone replacement therapy was not a fully voluntary decision, but the result of the society's refusal to accept her gender identity and the negation of her voice. This lack of agency to define her own gender identity is transformed into this game by Anthropy's intentional design of depriving game players' agency to the avatar. That the avatar cannot move or act purely based off of players' preference, but is restricted by forces from the environment, outside of their individual control. By taking over players' agency in dysphoria, Anthropy puts player in this negative position with a lack of control over the situation, just like what she went through before. The annoyance and the frustration players felt about the game's rules are exactly what Anthropy felt about society's judgment. The game mechanic allows player to truly relate to Anthropy's lack of agency to define her own identity and control over her own body, thus evoking this authentic feeling of bitterness and unfairness in players. In the meantime, the description of the avatar remains fluid. She becomes a block that constantly gets stuck, a shell that is being attacked, a plane that passes through all the hoops, a butterfly that flies up from the sea. This constant changing representation of the avatar is an intentional decision made by the game designer to more vividly convey her feeling as a transgender person facing all the inconvenience and misunderstanding in her life. The game's decision to adopt these visual metaphors makes it similar to poetry, where all the images are created for the purpose of preserving feelings and allowing players to relate to the game designer. Essentially, the visual metaphor becomes a bridge that fills the gap between the virtual and the real, a device that reconstructs within the game player a more authentic emotion that Anthropy had in her life. Dysphoria is no longer an anti-form. Instead, this game breaks the boundary between the virtual and the real. It becomes the reality. Another thing that I noticed after playing the game is the bright color contrast. The game incorporates super bright colors and put them together that create great contrast in each scene. After playing the game for a while, I started to feel dizzy and got a pretty serious headache afterwards. Looking back at my physical and mental response to the game, I started to see the great effect of color choices on people's perception of the game. According to studies, bright colors impact people's psychological responses, cause stress, and even increase their blood pressure. The constant use of the bright colors throughout the game, together with the electronic, fast-paced soundtrack, intensified my reaction to the game and kept me constantly under pressure. My reaction to the game forms an interesting coherence with Anthropy's high blood pressure when going through hormone control set treatment. This uneasy feeling serves as an imitation of the side effect Anthropy had while taking the therapy. Again, the color choice helps create the connection between the players and the game designer. Allowing the player uses the game to generate alliances with the real world, both physically and emotionally, thus recreating the reality within the space of game. By having a close reading of Dysphoria's choice of mechanics, representation, aesthetics, and using it as an extended discussion of Meyer's reading, we critically examine the potential of video games and its relationship with the reality. Unlike what Meyer believes, games are not only anti-forms that are unreal. Through careful design, video games are able to break the boundary between the virtual and the real. Video games create reality within the game setting, and their effect can be long-lasting. This paper aims to invite readers to further explore the possibility of video games in this direct interaction with the society, and think of the possibility to use video games to more directly engage in social discourse and change.